You are a disgrace to this family, Alex. Get out of my house right now. My father's words echoed through the living room decorated with Christmas lights, completely silencing the conversation of the 23 family members gathered there. Uncles, aunts, cousins, everyone stopped eating and looked directly at me, some with pity, others with that morbid curiosity people have when they witness a car accident. I stood next to the 7-foot Christmas tree, holding the gift I had bought especially for him, an Italian silk tie that cost $300, almost half my waiter's salary for that month. Dad, I just said I was thinking about changing careers and... Changing careers. He rose from the brown leather armchair, the one no one else was allowed to sit in. You're 28 years old, Alex. 28. And you want to quit the only decent job you've ever had to play businessman with what money? My name is Alex, and on that Christmas in 2016, at the age of 28, I discovered that my own father saw me as the biggest failure in the Morrison family. Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Holdings, a construction empire that had dominated the Chicago real estate market for over 40 years. The man who built the skyscrapers that defined the city skyline. And in his eyes, his eldest son was nothing but a pathetic dreamer waiting tables at a downtown restaurant. Richard, maybe we're being a little hard on the kid, my mother Margaret, murmured without looking up from her plate. Hard. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Margaret, look at him. Look at our son. He graduated from Northwestern, one of the best universities in the country, with a degree in business, and what does he do? He serves food to people who actually work. I felt my face flush. Around the table my cousins, all working in the family business, all earning 6 figures a year, all approved by the patriarch, avoided my gaze. Dad, I have a business plan. If you could just... A business plan for what? To open another little restaurant that will go out of business in 6 months. He picked up his beer and took a long swig. Alex, do you want to know the truth? I never expected anything from you. I always knew you'd be the failure of the family. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children stopped playing with their new toys. Get out of my house, he repeated, lower now, but with a coldness that cut deeper than the shouting. And don't come back until you have something of value to show for yourself. Something real. Not childish dreams. I dropped the gift on the floor and walked toward the door. No one said a word. No one got up. My own mother continued carving the turkey as if nothing had happened. But as I put on my coat and opened the door of the $3 million mansion in Lake Forest, something changed inside me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness. It was something much more dangerous, crystal clear determination. Because what my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I already had more than a business plan. I had an idea that would revolutionize the way people bought homes, a technology that would render obsolete the business model that had sustained the Morrison empire for decades. And as I drove down Lake Shore Drive that cold December night, with the skyscrapers my father built shining in the distance, I made a silent promise: I would return to that house. But next time, it would be as the man who bought everything Richard Morrison ever owned. If you're enjoying this story of how a family humiliation turned into the sweetest revenge I've ever witnessed, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened over the next 5 years changed not only my life, but the entire Chicago real estate industry. But first, I need to tell you about the 6 months of hell that followed that night. Because my father wasn't done trying to destroy me yet. The 6 months that followed that Christmas night were a plunge into waters I didn't know were so deep. Richard Morrison wasn't content with just kicking me out of the house. He decided to make sure I really failed. The Monday after Christmas, when I returned to work at Bistro Lumiere, my boss, Antoine, called me into his office. A short, nervous man, he avoided my gaze as he shuffled through some papers. Alex, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go. What do you mean? My performance has always been excellent. You yourself said last week that. We've had some concerns about your conduct. He finally looked at me, and I saw pity in his eyes. A very influential client called questioning your professional integrity. I didn't need to ask who the client was. Richard Morrison had connections all over Chicago. High-end restaurants depended on executives like him for their corporate events. Antoine, you know that's a lie. I know, Alex. But I can't afford to lose important contracts. He slid an envelope across the table. 2 weeks' pay. It's the best I can do. I walked through the icy January streets carrying a box containing my personal belongings, a few management books, a mug my ex-girlfriend had given me, a framed Employee of the Month certificate. It all fit in a shoebox. But that was just the beginning. I tried other restaurants. 5 interviews in 2 weeks. They all started well until they mentioned they would check my references. 24 hours later, it was always the same call: "We've decided to go with another candidate." Richard had a network of influence that I had completely underestimated. 40 years of building relationships in Chicago, doing favors, creating debts. Every door I tried to open, he had already closed before I even got close. By early February, I was living on $600 in my bank account and surviving on instant ramen in a 1-bedroom apartment I shared with 2 college roommates. The heat barely worked, and I slept with 3 blankets. That's when Marcus, my roommate, came home with a strange look on his face. "Alex, have you seen the local news today?" "No. Why?" He turned on the television. The reporter was standing in front of Morrison Holdings Plaza, the 40-story corporate building my father had built as the company's headquarters. Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Holdings, announced today a new $200 million housing project in the South Loop. When asked about family succession, Morrison was blunt: "My eldest son has chosen a different path. I can't force someone to have ambition if it simply isn't there." I felt the blood rush to my head. He was using my situation as propaganda, creating a public narrative that I was the lazy son who chose to waste the opportunities he offered me. "My other sons, David and Michael, are preparing to take on greater responsibilities in the company," Richard continued in the interview. "They understand the value of hard work and family commitment." Marcus turned off the television. "Man, I'm sorry. I didn't know it was that bad." But I barely heard his words. Because in that moment, watching my father use my humiliation as a public relations tool, something crystallized inside me. It was no longer about proving my worth to him. It was about completely destroying the foundation of arrogance that allowed this kind of calculated cruelty. That night, alone in my cold bedroom, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not a resume or a cover letter. I wrote the first draft of what would become Tech Home, a platform that would use artificial intelligence and virtual reality to revolutionize the way people bought real estate. The idea wasn't new. I had been developing the concept for 2 years, ever since I realized how inefficient the home buying process was and how dependent it was on middlemen who added little real value. But now I had a crystal clear focus: to create something that would render the exact type of company my father ran obsolete. Traditional construction companies depended on asymmetric information. They controlled inventory, dictated prices, manipulated schedules. My platform would eliminate these gatekeepers, connecting buyers directly with builders through technology that would make the entire process transparent and efficient. While Richard Morrison used connections and intimidation to maintain his empire, I would build something that made those tactics irrelevant. 3 weeks later, I got a job washing dishes at a 24-hour diner on the south side of town. $15 an hour, 12-hour shifts, no benefits. My hands were permanently red and cracked from the hot water and chemicals. But every night after work, I coded. I taught myself programming through free online tutorials. I studied machine learning, interface design, systems architecture. I slept 4 hours a night and woke up with my fingers still sore from typing. What my father didn't understand, what he would never understand, was that his cruelty had given me the most powerful fuel possible: absolute clarity of purpose. Because while he slept peacefully in his $3 million mansion, savoring his victory over his failed son, I was building the weapon that would destroy everything he had built. And the most ironic part? He gave me the motivation, focus, and time I needed to do it. By isolating me from his world, he gave me complete freedom to create something completely new. But before I could change the industry, I had to discover something crucial about Morrison Holdings' business. Something Richard had been hiding for decades, and that would become the key to his complete destruction. In March, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Richard decided to escalate his campaign of personal destruction. The first bombshell came via David, my middle brother. He showed up at the diner at 2 in the morning, just as I was finishing my shift. I had never set foot in a place like that in my life, a 24-hour diner on the south side, with cracked Formica counters and the permanent smell of greasy bacon. "Alex." He slid into the corner booth, clearly uncomfortable with his surroundings. "We need to talk." I finished cleaning the last few pans and sat down across from him. David had always been the diplomat in our family, the middle child who tried to mediate conflicts. But his face was tense in a way I had never seen before. "Dad hired a private investigator," he said bluntly. "What do you mean?" "He wants to document your current situation. To protect the company in case you try to sue for family discrimination or something." David avoided my gaze. "But I think it's more than that, Alex. He's obsessed. He talks about you constantly. How you're a threat to the family's reputation." I felt a chill in my stomach. "What kind of investigation?" "Your finances, your movements, who you talk to. He's convinced you're planning something to hurt the company." David finally looked at me. "And the worst part is, he hired Johnson & Associates." Johnson & Associates. The most ruthless corporate security firm in Chicago. Specializing in investigations that often crossed ethical lines. Richard wasn't just investigating me, he was trying to find anything he could use to destroy me completely. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because it's not right, Alex. You're my brother." He slid an envelope across the table. "And because I found this in his office." Inside the envelope were copies of financial reports. Not mine, Morrison Holdings. Pages and pages of documents that showed something that made me question everything I knew about my father. The company was in serious financial trouble. The $200 million project Richard had announced on television? Financed entirely by high-risk loans that depended on sales that didn't yet exist. Morrison Holdings was leveraged to the hilt, propping up his image of success through a complex web of debt and contracts that could collapse at any moment. "He's desperate, Alex," David whispered. "The company's been bleeding money for 18 months. All that confidence, that arrogance? It's a facade. He's terrified that someone will find out the truth." I studied the numbers. It was worse than David had imagined. Richard wasn't just in trouble, he was running a corporate Ponzi scheme, using investor money to pay suppliers for old projects while promising returns he knew were impossible to deliver. "And I'm a threat, how?" I asked. "You know the company's systems better than any of us. You worked there during college summers, interned in the finance department. If you wanted to expose this..." Of course. My threat wasn't business competition. It was inside knowledge. Richard was so afraid that I would discover the truth about his operations that he decided to destroy me preemptively. That night, I walked through the empty streets of Chicago with the documents hidden inside my coat. The temperature was below freezing, but I hardly felt the cold. My mind was processing the implications of what I had discovered. For 3 months, I had believed that my father's cruel behavior was purely personal, disappointment in my failure as a son. But now I saw the truth. He was projecting his own impending failure onto me, turning his paranoia into justification for cruelty. Morrison Holdings, the empire he had built over 40 years, was crumbling. And rather than admit his mistakes or ask for help, Richard chose to destroy his own family to protect his facade of success. Arriving at my apartment, I turned on my laptop and opened the Tech Home files for the first time in weeks. I had been so focused on just surviving that I had neglected my project. But now, looking at the code I had written and the business models I had developed, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. My platform wouldn't just eliminate middlemen in real estate. It would make the entire financial process behind building and selling properties completely transparent. Investors would have real-time access to actual costs, verifiable timelines, and returns based on hard data instead of empty promises. It was exactly the kind of tool that would expose operations like Morrison Holdings in an instant. And at that moment, at 5 o'clock on a cold Thursday morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to build a company to prove my worth. I was going to build a company that would make it impossible for people like my father to operate in the shadows, manipulating numbers and destroying lives to protect their egos. I opened a new file on my computer and started typing. Not code this time, but a strategy. A 3-phase plan that would use Richard's own arrogance and paranoia against him. Phase 1. Finish Tech Home in total secrecy, using the next 6 months to build a working product that no private investigator could trace. Phase 2. Use my knowledge of Morrison Holdings systems to identify unhappy customers and frustrated investors who would be open to alternatives. Phase 3. Launch Tech Home directly into the Chicago market, offering total transparency in an industry that depended on hidden information to survive. It wouldn't just be revenge. It would be evolution. And the most ironic part? Richard had given me everything I needed to destroy him. By kicking me out of the house, he forced me to develop complete independence. By sabotaging my jobs, he taught me how to function without connections or favors. By investigating me, he revealed his own vulnerabilities through thinly veiled desperation. While he was spending thousands of dollars hiring investigators to uncover my secret plans, I was literally building the tool that would render his business model obsolete. And he would never know until it was too late. Because what Richard Morrison never understood about me, what none of the Morrisons understood, was that I wasn't trying to destroy the family legacy. I was building a new legacy that would render the old one irrelevant. I closed my laptop as the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline. In a few hours, I would be back at the diner washing more dishes, serving more coffee, and accepting more silent humiliation. But now each shift had a different purpose. Each hour working for $15 was an hour further away from the private investigator's radar. Each day pretending to be the failed son was one more day to perfect the tool that would redefine the entire Chicago real estate industry. And when it was over, when Tech Home was ready and I had built the necessary network of contacts, Richard Morrison would discover that the biggest mistake of his life wasn't underestimating me. It was giving me enough time to become invisible while I built his replacement. May arrived with constant rains that turned Chicago into a gray city, but I hardly noticed the weather. My nights had become a precise ritual: arrive home at 3 in the morning after my shift at the diner, take a shower to wash off the grease, and sit at the computer until 7 in the morning. Tech Home was taking shape. The algorithm for matching buyers and builders was already working in local tests. I managed to convince 3 small independent builders to participate in a pilot program, offering full cost transparency in exchange for direct access to their customers. It was the exact opposite of the Morrison Holdings model, where information was power and power meant total control. But technological development was only half the battle. The other half was much more delicate. During my breaks at the diner, I studied Richard's every public move over the past 6 months. Interviews, appearances at events, statements to the press. I noticed a worrying pattern. He was doubling down on ever larger projects, using increasingly aggressive rhetoric about eliminating unfair competition in the real estate market. The private investigator was still following me. Johnson and Associates were professionals. I rarely saw them, but I knew they were there. Different cars parked on my street, people reading newspapers at the diner during my shifts, discreet cameras at angles that covered my regular movements. Richard was spending at least $5,000 a month watching me. Money his struggling company couldn't afford to waste. It was David who gave me the next crucial piece of the puzzle. We met at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park on a rainy Tuesday. He looked thinner, more tense than the last time I saw him. "Things are getting worse at the office," he said without preamble. "Dad fired 12 people last week. He blamed restructuring, but everyone knows it's money." "And Michael? How's he handling it?" I asked about our younger brother. "That's the strange part." David lowered his voice. "Michael has started asking questions. About the finances, about contracts, about decisions Dad makes without consulting anyone. And Dad is obsessed with the idea that you're behind it." "What do you mean?" "He thinks you're manipulating Michael against him. Yesterday he yelled in the office that you were recruiting traitors from within the family." David made quotation marks with his fingers. "Alex, he's paranoid. He sees conspiracy everywhere." I absorbed this information as I watched the rain stream down the cafe window. Richard was so desperate to find an external enemy that he couldn't see the real problems in the structure he had built. Did he mention anything specific about Michael? "He said he's going to protect the company from destructive influences. And when I asked him what that meant, he looked at me like I was a suspect too." David stirred his coffee nervously. "Alex, I think he's considering removing Michael from the business as well." It was perfect. Richard was destroying his own family in an attempt to destroy me. The more paranoid he became, the more isolated he became, the more questionable decisions he made. That night, I changed my strategy. I didn't need to attack Morrison Holdings directly. I just needed to speed up the process of self-destruction that Richard had already started. I opened a new file on my computer and began mapping out all of Morrison Holdings' public contracts from the last 2 years. Information available in municipal records, mandatory financial reports, documents that any citizen could access. What I discovered was even worse than the documents David had shown me. Richard was using a technique called cascade financing. Essentially, he was using money from investors in one project to cover costs from previous projects that were behind schedule. It was technically legal, but it created a chain of dependency that could collapse if any link broke. And I could break that link. The Morrison Harbor project, a luxury lakeside residential complex, depended on city approvals that were 4 months late. Richard had promised investors that the approvals would come through in June. But city documents showed that there were serious environmental issues that hadn't even been addressed. If the approvals were denied, and everything indicated they would be, Richard would have to return $120 million he had already spent on other projects. I didn't have to sabotage anything. I just had to make sure the right information got to the right people at the right time. I created an anonymous account and sent a detailed email to the Chicago Tribune, highlighting the discrepancies between Richard's public promises and the reality of the municipal documents. It wasn't defamation, it was investigative journalism based on public documents. Meanwhile, Tech Home continued to grow. June rolled around, and I had 17 independent builders on the platform, offering total transparency to buyers who were tired of opaque processes and hidden costs. Every successful transaction on my platform was a transaction that didn't happen through companies like Morrison Holdings. The crucial moment came on a Thursday in June. I got a text from David. Tribune is publishing article on Morrison Harbor tomorrow. Dad is in a panic. That night, working my regular shift at the diner, I saw Richard for the first time in 6 months. He came in at 2 in the morning alone, wearing a wrinkled suit I'd never seen him wear before. He sat down at the counter and ordered black coffee. For 20 minutes, we stood 3 feet apart. I washed dishes, he drank coffee and read something obsessively on his cell phone. The private investigator was probably outside, documenting our encounter. Richard didn't recognize me. Or he pretended not to. When he got up to leave, he left a $5 tip, more than any customer had left that week. It wasn't until after he left that I realized what had happened. The man who kicked me out of my house for being a loser had just tipped me without knowing who I was. His own paranoia had blinded him so much that he could no longer distinguish real threats from imaginary shadows. And while he was spending fortunes investigating me, looking for evidence of conspiracies that didn't exist, I was systematically building the tool that would make his business model obsolete. If you've been following this journey of how a rejected son became the architect of change his family never saw coming, be sure to subscribe, because what happened when the Tribune article was published exceeded even my wildest expectations. The following Friday, at 6 in the morning, I got a call that would change everything. On the other end of the line was a voice I didn't expect to hear, Michael, my younger brother. Alex, his voice was tense, almost whispering. I need to see you. Now. Dad just did something he can't take back. Michael's call came at 6:15 a.m. on a Friday morning that would change everything. Alex, I need to see you now. Dad just fired the entire accounting team and hired an outside firm for an emergency audit. I met Michael in Millennium Park an hour later. He was sitting on a bench, holding 2 coffees and looking 10 years older than the last time I saw him. The Tribune article came out this morning, he said, handing me one of the coffees. Dad is in a complete panic. He fired 17 people yesterday, including Janet. Janet Morrison, no relation, just a coincidence of last names, had been the chief financial officer for 15 years. If Richard fired her, it meant she had discovered something he couldn't allow to get out. There's more, Michael continued. He's frozen all payments to suppliers and canceled the Morrison Harbor project, officially for strategic re-evaluation. But Alex, the investors are demanding their money back. It was exactly what I had predicted. The Tribune article had forced Richard into desperate decisions that only accelerated the collapse I had been preparing for months. And there's something you need to know, Michael lowered his voice. Dad found out about Tech Home. I felt the blood drain from my face. How? The private investigator. They tracked your online activity for the last 6 months. Dad knows you built a real estate platform and that you have 17 partner builders. Michael looked at me with a mixture of admiration and terror. He's convinced you planned this whole thing to destroy the company. For a moment, I considered denying it, minimizing it, pretending that Tech Home was just a personal project unrelated to the problems at Morrison Holdings. But looking at my younger brother, the only one in the family who had the courage to warn me, I decided on honesty. I didn't plan to destroy the company, Michael. I planned to make it irrelevant. I explained everything. Tech Home, the 6 months of secret development, how the total transparency of my platform was eliminating the need for middlemen who operated in the shadows like Richard always did. Jesus, Alex. You really did it. You built an alternative to his business model. And now that he knows? Now he's planning to sue you for corporate sabotage and misuse of confidential information. Michael looked out at the Chicago skyline. He's hired Mitchell and Associates. Mitchell and Associates. The most aggressive law firm in town, specializing in destroying opponents through lengthy and expensive litigation. Richard wasn't just trying to stop me, he was trying to annihilate me financially before I could fight back. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I grabbed my cell phone and opened a folder I'd created months ago. Inside were 53 documents organized chronologically, each verified and authenticated by a forensic accountant I'd hired with my tip money. Michael, do you know Sarah Chun from the SEC? The fraud investigator? Why? Because 6 months ago, I filed a formal complaint about Morrison Holdings' financial practices. With complete evidence. I showed him the confirmation of receipt. The official investigation began on Tuesday. Michael's face went pale. What evidence? Remember the documents David showed me? That was just the tip of the iceberg. I got access to bank records, construction contracts, correspondence with investors. Everything. How? Janet Morrison approached me in March. She had known something was wrong for months, but she needed someone outside the company to confirm her suspicions. Someone who understood the internal systems but wasn't compromised by the power structure. Michael was silent for a long moment, processing the implications. Alex, if the SEC finds evidence of fraud. When it finds, I corrected. Richard wasn't just in financial trouble. He's been running a corporate Ponzi scheme for at least 2 years, using money from new investors to pay promises to old ones. And he's documented everything in writing. At that moment, my cell phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the ID showed Mitchell and Associates. I answered calmly. Alex Morrison? Yes. This is Jonathan Mitchell. I represent Morrison Holdings in matters of intellectual property and corporate sabotage. I need to inform you. Mr. Mitchell, I interrupted politely. Before you continue, I would like to mention that this call is being recorded, as permitted by Illinois law, and that I have my own legal representation. There was a pause. I didn't know you had a lawyer. Chen, Rodriguez and Partners. Specialists in whistleblower complaints to the SEC. They will be present during any future communication. Another longer pause. I see. We'll be in touch. The call ended. Michael looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. Alex, you really planned all this. I didn't plan the destruction of Morrison Holdings, Michael. I planned my own freedom. And when Richard tried to destroy me preemptively, he only accelerated the process he himself started. My cell phone rang again. This time it was David. Alex, where are you? Dad's at the office screaming that he's going to drag you through the courts until there's nothing left of you. And 3 federal agents showed up here 20 minutes ago. It was faster than I expected. The SEC usually took weeks to move an investigation from paper to direct action. Unless. David, the outside audit firm Dad hired, you know which one? Thornfield Associates. Why? I smiled for the first time in months. Thornfield Associates was an auditing firm that worked exclusively with federal agencies on corporate fraud investigations. Richard, in his paranoia, had hired federal auditors to investigate his own books. Richard didn't hire an outside audit. He facilitated a federal investigation of his own company. Total silence on the other end of the line. What does that mean? It means that instead of finding evidence against me, the auditors are documenting decades of questionable practices that I reported months ago. I got up from the bench and started walking. And it means that Richard Morrison just found out that his attempt to destroy me was exactly the catalyst the SEC needed to turn a preliminary investigation into a formal criminal action. As I walked through the streets of Chicago toward my apartment, where I would prepare for what would be the most important day of my life, one last irony dawned on me. Richard had spent 6 months and tens of thousands of dollars trying to uncover my secret plan to destroy his company. But my plan had never been to destroy Morrison Holdings. My plan was to build something better. And let his own arrogance do the rest. At 2 p.m. that Friday, as federal agents left Morrison Holdings Plaza carrying boxes of evidence and Richard Morrison faced the first of many conversations with federal prosecutors, I was on my laptop finalizing the last details of Tech Home's official launch. The failed son who had been kicked out of the family Christmas was about to revolutionize the entire Chicago real estate industry. And the man who tried to destroy me had just discovered that he had created the very conditions necessary for his own downfall. 3 weeks after that fateful Friday, I was sitting in a meeting room on the 32nd floor of the Willis Tower, looking out the panoramic window as my lawyers finalized the documents that would transform Tech Home from a secret startup into a concrete reality. Across town, Richard Morrison was in a very different room, a federal holding cell, awaiting a bail hearing while federal prosecutors organized 47 counts of fraud, money laundering, and securities law violations. The fall was faster and more complete than even I had anticipated. When the SEC finished its external audit, it found evidence dating back to 2008. Richard hadn't just been running a Ponzi scheme for 2 years, he'd been doing it for nearly a decade, using each new project to cover up the failures of the previous ones. The total value of the fraud exceeded $400 million. Morrison Holdings was completely dissolved in a court-supervised liquidation. Every property, every contract, every asset was valued and sold to compensate aggrieved investors. The $3 million mansion in Lake Forest, where I was kicked out that Christmas, auctioned off to pay legal fees. But the most surreal part of the whole story happened on a rainy Tuesday in September. David and Michael showed up at my new office on LaSalle Street, a modern 1,000-square-foot space where I had set up Tech Home's headquarters after closing an initial round of $15 million in financing. "Alex," David said, looking 10 years older than he had the year before, "we need to apologize to you." They sat down in the leather chairs across from my desk, ironically, furniture very similar to what Richard had in his old office at Morrison Holdings. "Not for our father," Michael added quickly. "He made his own choices. But for our part in all this. For not standing up for you when we should have." It was a conversation I had rehearsed in my head dozens of times, but when it finally happened, I found that my anger had turned into something much more complex. "You were his employees before you were my brothers," I replied. "And what Richard did wasn't your fault." "But it was our fault for staying silent," David insisted. "When we saw you washing dishes in that diner, when we found out Dad was investigating you, when we realized how obsessed he was with destroying you, we should have spoken up." Michael leaned forward. "His company is gone, Alex. But yours. Tech Home is changing everything. Independent builders are competing with big corporations for the first time in decades. Buyers are saving an average of 30% on transaction costs." It was true. In the 6 months since its official launch, Tech Home had processed over 200 real estate transactions in Chicago, connecting buyers directly with builders through total cost transparency and real-time verifiable schedules. Large construction companies that had relied on asymmetric information to maintain inflated margins were being forced to compete on real merit for the first time. "And Margaret?" I asked about my mother. "She's processing everything," David hesitated. "She lost the house, obviously. She's living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston. She works part-time at an art gallery." "And how does she feel about all this?" Michael exchanged a glance with David. "She said something I'll never forget," Michael replied. "Last week, when we went to visit her, she was organizing old family photos. She found one of you at your graduation from Northwestern. She looked at the picture for a long time and said, 'I always knew Alex was the smartest one of you kids. I just didn't realize he was also the bravest.'" I felt something tighten in my chest. "Alex," David continued, "I know we have no right to ask this after everything, but would you consider hiring us?" The question took me by surprise. "At Tech Home. We have construction experience, we know the Chicago market, and," Michael paused, searching for the right words, "and we want to work for something that really makes a difference." not some scheme disguised as progress. I looked at my brothers, really looked at them, for the first time in years. David, always the diplomat, now seemed genuinely humble. Michael, the youngest, had a determination in his eyes I didn't know he had. "You would understand that there is no nepotism here," he said finally. "No special treatment because you're family. Merit, transparency, accountability." "We understand," they replied almost simultaneously. "And you'd have to start like any other employee. Starting salary, no guarantees, 90-day probationary period." "Perfect," David nodded. 3 months later, David was leading our expansion into Milwaukee, connecting local builders with buyers through our platform. Michael had developed a sustainability verification system that was attracting interest from ESG-focused investors. Both proved to be exceptional employees, hardworking, honest, and genuinely committed to the values I had built into the company. Margaret visited the office once, on a Thursday in November. She walked through the open spaces, watched the monitors showing real-time transactions, and chatted briefly with the team. Before she left, she hugged me, the first physical embrace between us in nearly 2 years. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "And I'm sorry for what we allowed to happen." It wasn't instant forgiveness. Damaged relationships take time to rebuild, and some wounds leave permanent scars. But it was a start. As for Richard, he was sentenced to 16 years in federal prison. No parole for the first 8 years. At 63, when he gets out, he will be a completely different man in a world that has changed beyond recognition. During the trial, he looked at me once. There was no anger in his eyes, no regret. Just deep confusion, as if he still couldn't process how the failure of a son had become the architect of his downfall. I felt no satisfaction at that moment. Just a heavy sadness at the futility of it all, at the family that could have been, at the relationships that were destroyed, at the time wasted on conflicts that never needed to exist. Tech Home continued to grow. We expanded to 15 cities, processed billions in transactions, and created jobs for hundreds of people. But the real success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the letters I received from families who were able to buy their first home through our platform, saving enough money to furnish it properly. It was in the independent builders who could finally compete with large corporations. It was in the transparency that forced the entire industry to operate more honestly. A year later, on Christmas 2017, I hosted a dinner at my new home in Lincoln Park. It was a modest 3-bedroom house that I bought through Tech Home itself, using the total transparency I had created. David and Michael came with their families. Margaret brought a new boyfriend, a retired history teacher who treated her with genuine kindness. A few Tech Home employees who didn't have family nearby joined us. There was no place set for Richard. Not out of cruelty, but out of acceptance. He had chosen a path that made his presence impossible. During dinner, Michael raised a toast. To Alex, who taught us that true success isn't about defeating enemies, but about building something that makes it necessary for everyone to be better. It was the fundamental difference Richard never understood. He saw business as war, winners and losers, territory to be conquered, enemies to be destroyed. I saw it as evolution, systems that needed improvement, transparency that benefited everyone, progress that elevated the entire ecosystem. His approach built a 40-year empire that crumbled in weeks when exposed to the light. My approach built a platform that grew stronger every time someone tried to find flaws or vulnerabilities. If this story of how family rejection turned into a business revolution has inspired you, subscribe to the channel. We have dozens of similar stories about people who turned adversity into triumph through intelligence, persistence, and integrity. Today, 5 years after that humiliating Christmas, Tech Home is valued at $300 million. I get invitations to speak at tech conferences around the world. Universities study our model as an example of ethical disruption in traditional markets. But the most significant victory came one December morning when I was working in the office and got an unexpected phone call. It was Richard, calling from prison. "Alex," his voice was weaker, older. "I know I have no right to talk to you, but, congratulations. I read about Tech Home in a magazine here. It's exactly the kind of thing I should have built years ago." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just acknowledgement. And in that moment, I finally understood that the real victory was never about destroying Richard Morrison or proving he was wrong about me. It was about becoming exactly who I needed to be, regardless of his approval or disapproval. The son he kicked out of his house for being a loser had become the man who forever changed the industry he spent his life trying to dominate. And the ultimate irony? I did it using the very values he rejected: honesty, transparency, collaboration, and the radical belief that true success lifts everyone up, not just those at the top.